So this is it. We finally made it to the end of administrative law, and this module is really a point at which we can stop and have a look at what we've studied, think about where we're going, and also to think about where the system's going. Because more than any other area of law that I know of, administrative law is something that's in flux, that's constantly changing. The administrative law that I studied 20 years ago is, on the face of it, similar today. We use the same sorts of principles, the same sorts of ideas, but the world in which it operates and the way in which it operates is completely different. The administrative law that I studied, and I don't want to sound like, an old guy having a fireside chat here, but computers were still not very common in offices when I studied administrative law. And those that were used were often used as word processing systems to type up documents, but the idea of storing and gathering and collecting and comparing information was quite new. And people were still talking about the ways in which you could actually try and connect data sets together. There was no internet. There was no simple way in which computers could share information. Certainly there wasn't a way in which you could actually get information out to the public, short of printing a lot of flyers and putting them in offices, and suggesting that if people wanted more information, they could come into an office somewhere and they could pick up a photocopied flyer. So the world, the way in which government operates, has changed significantly. So the idea of what a fair hearing is, it's still the same principle. It still applies, but the speed at which government decisions are made, the complexity, the data that's drawn on, has entirely changed the landscape around which that law operates. So we've got an increasingly complex social system. We've got increasing digitisation, where information and knowledge is created in a digital environment. It wasn't that long ago where people filled out forms by hand, and then if you were going to put them on computers at all, you scanned them. Someone had to sit there and scan them all, or do data entry to put the information into a computer system. We now take for granted the ease at which you can, well, maybe we don't in terms of the census, because that's a great example of when these systems fail. But we assume they're not going to fail. We assume that we can jump onto a website somewhere, fill in our census details, and it's not all going to collapse, either due to sinister, mysterious foreign hackers out of some kind of Thomas Clancy novel, or due to just government incompetence, which is possibly a bit more likely. We also work in a globalised world that has changed the way in which admin law operates, because governmental decisions are now connected into international issues, and we see the rise of things like trade agreements becoming more important in terms of governmental decision making, and raising real challenges in terms of what this means for sovereignty. And at what point does individual or collective citizen sovereignty start to give way to pressure from international trade, international business, other governments? We also have seen the rise of privatisation, which has been a real challenge to admin law, one where I'm very proud to see the judges fighting back. We see the particular issue of privative clauses being used as a somewhat slimy way for governments to try and take accountability for what they do and decisions they make, and to push them out of the public domain, out of public scrutiny. And this is certainly done in a way that's deliberately designed to try and reduce transparency and reduce public view and public accountability. And it's been very good to see that the judges have been expansionist in the way in which they deal with administrative law, and have resisted government attempts to hide away and to use privatisation as a way to stop them being accountable for the decisions that they make. And this is an issue that is going to get more important soon. That would be my prediction, that it's not going to go away anywhere soon. The privatisation agenda in Australia is strong from both the major political parties. They're both committed to privatising and small government, and there's a a real danger there, and this is where administrative law really is on the front lines in terms of being a way to try and protect individuals from their rights being subsumed by corporate interests, whether it be the individual who's having difficulty with the public transport corporation, at one end of the scale, or people facing detention and the rise of private security corporations and private prisons and those sort of things at the other extremes. We're also seeing the rise of the idea of algorithmic justice, and that is automated computerized decision making. And this is not some kind of bleak science fiction vision of the future. This is something that's already happening. And it's something in some ways that's inevitable, but it's something that I really believe needs to be more public visibility and debate around. We're seeing the rise of big data, and that's the idea that we can actually look for patterns in massive data sets that we're now collecting. And we can start to understand things on the basis of those huge data sets. And in some situations, why not? So if you have a data system that logs something where there's a limited amount of resources that you can apply. So let's look at something like where we place ambulances. Not just in terms of where we build new ambulance stations, but where we put staff, where we buy new ambulances, where we place them. We could do that in the old-fashioned way, where we go, well, let's look at what happened last year, and let's get a bit of a general idea of where there's need, and then we'll project for the future, and then we'll decide for the next year that maybe we'll put more ambulances in this area. Or we can start drawing on the data that's collected every day through the ambulance's own data collection system, and we can keep up to the date information, and we can start using that information to start deploying ambulances on the basis of the data that we know. We know on a Friday night in this particular part of town we're going to need a lot of ambulances. There's a lot of pubs, there's going to be a lot of fights, we need ambulances here. We need ambulances here because while there isn't as much need, the issues might be more serious. We might have an area where there's a lot of older people living, and we have a need for ambulances that are more urgent, even though we don't have as much need, so we need to put an ambulance there. So there's all sorts of algorithms that can calculate that and can establish what that need is. But what you're also doing here now is handing over decisions that ordinarily would be made by a person to a machine. And that machine is operating under an algorithm that's been programmed by a person, but that algorithm is not necessarily transparent, and it's not necessarily something that's obvious. And I refer to in the notes the Gandhi bug from the Civilization game, which people who play games may be aware of, but I think it points to a very real kind of issue that can come out of these algorithmic systems. Basically, what's the quick version? In the Civilization game, you're building civilizations and you are competing with other historical leaders. And those historical leaders are ranked on various behavioural statistics which guide the way in which they behave in relation to you. And one of them is peaceful versus warlike. And of course, if you've got Genghis Khan as another world leader, he's going to be very warlike and he's going to be very aggressive in what he does. Gandhi, on the other hand, was the most peaceful. However, there was a slight bug in the system that as the game evolved and Gandhi became more peaceful, he actually flipped over from very, very peaceful to the highest level of warlike. So there was this weird bug in the game where you'd play with Gandhi and he'd be extremely peaceful through most of the game, and all of a sudden Gandhi would go psycho and would start invading you and doing all these terrible atrocities along the way. Now, people know about this because enough people played the game, enough people saw it, there was enough of a community around it, and the developers were open about it when they found out about it, that it's become one of those sort of notorious issues. And so you might be wondering, why are we talking about a video game here when we're talking about law? But the issue is, if these things aren't transparent and you don't have a large community of people who are discussing this with each other and saying, hey, did Gandhi go psycho? Yeah, Gandhi went absolutely psycho on me last night. What's going on? If people are all dealing with an algorithm individually, it becomes very difficult to notice that there's something going wrong behind the scenes. So, let's go back to the ambulance example. you might have individuals around the place saying, we tried to get an ambulance, and we had this terrible situation. We tried to get an ambulance, and we couldn't get one. And maybe people are joining the dots. Maybe they're on social media, they're able to see that. But it's very difficult to then distinguish that from the general complaints that you might get generally with any sort of public service, where people are never happy with ambulances. They're, it's a pretty tough job, but people are always unhappy when they're on waiting periods and so on. Limited resources. No one's going to get exactly what they want. How do you distinguish that from when there is a real problem in the system? Now, maybe in that situation, the actual ambulance, the paramedics and ambulance drivers, whatever, are in a better position to actually spot these things when they go wrong. If their computer's gone haywire and they know they're sitting around on a Friday night with nothing to do, and something's wrong, they are hopefully going to be in a position to fix it. But the point I'm getting is that we can get massive boosts in efficiencies through using these digital systems, through using the big data that we're gathering. But it means the very nature of what we're doing in terms of government, in terms of decision making, and definitely in terms of administrative law, is changing very, very dramatically. And watch this space. This is something that's evolving, and this is something that I think we need the future law graduates to be more on top of. We don't want people in administration who are responsible for these systems to have never thought about these issues. We need people who are aware of them, who are up to date on those issues. We don't necessarily need people who are both computer programmers and lawyers, although some of those would be quite useful. But we need people who are lawyers who actually understand the way in which computers operate, what computers do, what their limitations are, and what that means for our system of law, particularly administrative law. So that's a little bit of a quick look ahead, and I think hopefully it's a way of seeing the continuing evolution and continuing development of administrative law in a way that is relevant to you. And it's something that I think actually is quite exciting and quite interesting. And we are in a situation where we are looking at a future of sort of either the wonderful sci-fi vision of the future where computers handle all the tedious chores for us and our lives become substantially better because we actually have a very smooth, and we have that sort of Weberian bureaucracy enabled by technology, where we have everyone has a jetpack and a flying car because our future is bright. Or we could go the other way. We could go the Kafka way. We could go the dark dystopian future where technology and law is used as a way to put people in their place and to deny people their rights. And this is where our role as public lawyers, or our role as lawyers generally, becomes very, very important as the guardians of the legal system and as people who can keep an eye on these issues and watch as things develop.